think we have a good lecture today. What we're going to do is we're going to finish up our aggregate demand, aggregate supply module. And we're going to think about we're going to show how we can shift them and how we're able to model things like inflation, business cycles. Then we're going to start our next module, which is money, which I think is a fun one. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to think about inflation, and we're going to think about types of inflation. So one thing you might remember is we've talked about as inflation as being a general rise in prices. So let's think about, there's actually different types of inflation. So different causes of inflation, we'll see that they have different effects. So the first one we're going to discuss is what we call cost push inflation. So cost push inflation occurs when costs change, specifically when costs increase, and that leads to a decrease in supply. Here, when we were talking about individual goods supplied, I think we had the example of a increase in the price of electricity, how that would affect a steel mill that uses electricity. And we said that would be a decrease or a shift left of supply. Well, if something happens that affects lots and lots of firms, that will shift aggregate supply to the left. Let's think about what happens there. When we start off in initial long-run equilibrium, when aggregate supply shifts left, we wind up here. And what that means is that we get a decrease in GDP, so an increase in unemployment, and an increase in prices, which means inflation. So there's a term for this, when we have a decrease in GDP and an increase in prices, and that is called stagflation. So this most famously occurred in the mid to late 1970s. And this was related to an increase in the price of oil. Well, oil is an input for a lot of different goods. So, almost anything that you're producing or transporting, there's going to be oil and gasoline involved. And so the costs got really high. So we had like we said, a leftward shift of supply. And notice what happened. We had a big increase in unemployment. That's the blue. And we saw a spike in inflation. So that red line, when we say implicit price deflated, it's like a fancy way of talking about one way of calculating inflation. Just think of this as inflation. You see, we had at one point had inflation up over 5%, which that's a significant amount of inflation in 1 year for the United States. Next, we will discuss what's called demand pull inflation. And this is sort of rating the types of inflation. This is the good one. And because this is inflation that happens as a result of an increase in demand. So when we have demand pull inflation, what we're going to see is we move from here up to here. So you think this is just sort of, we all woke up today and, I'm looking at my stock portfolio and it looks like it's doing good. So I'm going to go buy myself a new car. Something like that happens to a whole bunch of people, shifts that aggregate demand. When we do this, we get an increase in prices and an increase in real GDP. Like we said, in this one, you can almost think of the inflation as being sort of a side effect of the increase in GDP, right? All of us decide we want to go spend more money and buy a car. Well, that's going to lead to us all sort of bidding up the price of cars being more expensive, hence inflation. So here you could think of sort of an example of this would be something that happened in the late 90s. This is when the tech boom was going on. So this is, I'm feeling good. My stock portfolio is looking great. My eToys stock is doing really well. And as a result, I go out and buy a bunch of stuff. And so we have a big increase in GDP. Notice unemployment goes down. However, we also see higher inflation. Remember the red line is inflation. So this is an example of we have demand pull inflation. So increase in aggregate demand leads to higher GDP, lower unemployment rate, and also higher inflation. Next, what we're going to discuss is the Phillips curve. So the Phillips curve was invented by a guy named Curve. That's our joke for the class. In some time, I think it was like sort of around the 50s, 60s era. And what he noticed was that there seemed to be this inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. So when we're up here, when we have high inflation, we have low unemployment. And when we have higher unemployment, we have low inflation. So it's sort of like a trade-off, right? These are two things you want, two things that are good. We want low inflation and we want low unemployment. And it seemed that there was this trade-off occurring. So the theory here, what they said was that inflation and unemployment are inversely related. Low unemployment means high inflation. High unemployment means low inflation. So what's going on here? Well, we think that when the economy is doing well, unemployment is low, employers have to pay workers more. This increases prices everywhere, leads to firm costs going up and leads to inflation. So this is going to be an example of if we go from maybe A down to C. Oops, nope, that is going to be an example of moving from A up to B. We have a decrease in unemployment rate as the economy has a higher GDP, and we also see higher inflation. And we can illustrate this using our aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. So first we have an increase in aggregate demand. So this is again what was happening in the late 90s, where demand increased. So we had an increase in GDP and an increase in the price level. That was illustrated on the Phillips curve. Reduced unemployment, higher inflation. Okay. You can also look at what happens when we have a decrease in aggregate demand. This is sort of think about a fairly typical recession where aggregate demand decreases. So for whatever reason, buyers decide that they are sort of feeling less confident with their future. So March, April this year, this is the sort of thing that happened. And we saw a big decrease in spending. People tended to save more of their incomes to sort of be prepared if bad things happened in the future. What do we get? Demand shifts left. So we get lower GDP and a reduction in the price level or lower inflation. So that's reflected by moving from 1 to 3. Inflation goes down, unemployment goes up. Okay. So a couple of caveats we want to note here. So this relationship sort of looked really nice in that graph I showed you at the beginning in the 60s. It hasn't been so clean cut lately. A couple of reasons why. First, this is a short run relationship. So remember we talked about short run versus long run. And one of the things we said was that in the long run, wages adjust to get unemployment back to the natural rate. So over time, unemployment should find its way back to the natural rate, because if unemployment is really high and nobody has jobs, then what happens is wages eventually go down and we see firms get back to hiring. This is also just talking about aggregate demand, right? So all of the changes we talked about, meaning about aggregate demand, they were moving aggregate demand to the right or to the left. If aggregate supply changes, then we have to move the whole Phillips curve, right? So with aggregate demand, we were just like going back here, we were finding different points on the curve. If aggregate supply changes, so here's aggregate supply. If we start moving it around, if we increase or decrease aggregate supply, then the whole Phillips curve is going to move. It'll shift. The whole thing will shift. And we don't have to worry about which direction it's going to shift or anything like that. We just want to sort of keep in mind the Phillips curve is only thinking about changes in aggregate demand. So now let's think a little more about changes in aggregate demand and aggregate supply and how we can sort of use them to think about expansions and recessions. So aggregate demand and aggregate supply can shift. We've seen that already. And we can find the effects of these shifts on GDP and the price level. So let's think about an increase in consumption. So we're going to start off in long run equilibrium. Aggregate demand equals aggregate supply equals long run aggregate supply. We start off with our price level of 100 and GDP is 24. First question, suppose Mike decides to spend billions of dollars to run for president. He spends so much money that the US economy sees a significant increase in expenditures on consumption. What happens in the short run? It shifts to the right. Consumption is a component of aggregate demand. So when consumption increases, aggregate demand increases. So animation, I'll show that again. Aggregate demand shifts to the right. So what happens in the short run to price level and GDP? How do we get there? Well, follow the yellow ball. We're going to go from aggregate demand 1, shift over to aggregate demand 2. The ball moves that way. And our price went from 100 up to 105. And our GDP went from 24 up to 26. All right, GDP is now 26 billion. Long run aggregate supply is 24 billion. Which of the following is true? And so what you want to think about here is that long run aggregate supply is sort of, well, that's what our economy is able to do in the long run. So that is with full employment, right? We don't have any excess unemployment. We don't have unemployment that's too low. 24 is sort of the realistic long run thing that we can do. Well, if GDP is now 26 billion, what does that say about our labor market? And what does that say about what's going on with wages and what we expect to happen to them? The answer here is B. We expect wages to rise. And the reason is, let me go through why. Well, GDP is above long run equilibrium GDP, right? GDP wants to be 26, or GDP wants to be 24 and it's 26 instead. So that means people are working overtime. People who should have been fired aren't being fired. So we have low frictional unemployment. So GDP is above the long-run equilibrium GDP, which means unemployment is below the natural rate. In the short run, wages are constant. So that's how things started off, right? We had this Mike Bloomberg spends all this money to run for president. Wages are constant. So now we've got lots of, if I'm running the company that does TV ads, I've got lots of business. I can charge Mike a lot of money, but I'm still paying my people the same amount of money. This is the idea of sticky wages. Right? So we start off with our sticky wages. However, in the long run, wages can change, right? Eventually, my employees are going to come say, hey, I need more money. Which means that employers are now competing for workers. Wages are bid up, right? So now I can tell my boss, you know what, if you don't pay me more money during my annual review, I'm going to quit and I'm going to go to another firm. So that's what I mean by say wages are bid up. Next question, what does that lead to? In the long run, wages will increase. Which of the following happens? Now, I want you to think about this as a supplier cost. Don't think about this as from the employee side of getting more money. There's a variety of reasons why that's not how we want to think about it. But for now, just think about, for this question, you want to focus on how this affects the firm. So the correct answer here, and when we're thinking about from the firm side, is that is an increase in cost to firms, right? All of a sudden, now I have to pay you more money, which means that my aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the left. So now let's illustrate that. We'll take the, oops. Take those two steps. So the first thing that happened, again, just follow the yellow ball. First thing that happens is Bloomberg comes out and spends a bunch of money to run for president. So you have a big increase in aggregate demand. The next thing that happens is that now after some time, wages get a chance to adjust. And so now firms have these higher costs. And that means that aggregate supply is going to shift to the left. So notice that in the long run, GDP goes back to its long run equilibrium. We started at 24, we end at 24. So we're back to full employment. The price level, however, is permanently higher. So that means we've had some inflation, but overall, on average, everyone should be doing as well as they were before. I'm getting paid 10% more. Everything I buy costs 10% more. Somebody wanted to see maybe that slide. So we are going to get the Friday song. So last class, I had to, my kids are doing stuff. My daughter's doing her remote school. The other one's out playing or something. And so my wife didn't get the text when I was like, send them in. And so I went and grabbed them. So I was gone for 45 seconds and like 100 people left, which I mean, on the one hand, I was like, oh, that's 100 people who didn't care to hear the song. But I was like, there were like 250 people who thought it was worth hanging around, who thought it was worth waiting to see the song. So I was like, that's pretty good. I said, the majority of them did. All right. So let me go ahead, pull up our next slideshow, which is money. We'll start that. So I think this is a fun module. We're just going to start it today. We're going to sort of learn some. It's going to be more of a fun, informative thing, not like math or anything. So we're going to start off with this question: what is money? Money is, and so we'll almost think of it as if I was trying to go to a society that didn't have money, it was just trying to barter for everything and trade. And I was like, hey, here's some reasons why you should start using money. So the first thing, money is a medium of exchange. It's an item used to facilitate trade. So here's what I mean. Let's suppose that this is my normal teaching spot in Wells Hall. So let's say that's me right here. And I have decided I want to buy a pair of shoes. And so hopefully maybe this guy right here is holding some new shoes and thinks I did a really good job lecturing. And so he's like, yeah, I think your lecture is worth a pair of shoes. I'll trade you a pair of shoes for an econ lecture, in which case we're in good shape. But the nice thing about, what if that guy's not there? So if we have money, that gives us this nice advantage of you do not have to find someone who has what you want. So he has shoes and wants what I have, which is a great economics lecture. Instead, Michigan State can pay me money, and then I can take that money, go to the store and buy some shoes. So that's the first use for money, is as a medium of exchange. Money is also a unit of account. It allows you to easily compare the value of two goods. So you think about it, if I give my lecture and then I'm going to say, all right, I'd like to trade this for some shoes. Well, now I'm going to think, all right, do I have to give you, you're going to give me 2 shoes for today's lecture, 3 shoes? I could say, well, I see the last person who bought shoes from you, they gave you an hour and a half of some carpentry work, and I don't know how that compares to one econ lecture. So it's not easy to compare the value of things. Whereas with money, it's much easier, right? I can say I'll be paid a specific number of dollars by Michigan State. I go to the store and I see that shoe costs me a specific number of dollars. And so I can very easily compare how much my labor is worth for that new shoe versus another shoe versus a new pair of pants. Okay, the third use for it is as a store of value. So this idea of me getting a shoe, that works fine. I'll teach him and I'll trade today for the shoe. Well, what if what I want is something in the future? So let's say I want maybe like some money to go on my summer vacation. So I'm going to rent a beach house somewhere. Well, even if she owns a beach house and that's right where I want to be for the summer, essentially what happens is I have to sort of say, I'm going to give you this lecture today. And she'll say, sure, I'll let you have my place this summer as a trade. Well, she has to sort of wait for the money. And I have to really hope that when I told her that she's going to live up to her word, and she is going to actually rent me the place on the beach. She's actually going to let me stay there. So sorry, she's not having to wait for the money. I'm having to wait for the beach house and hope that she's still around and doesn't, and holds true to her word. So what money does, it allows me to be paid now by Michigan State, hold on to that money, put it in a bank, keep it under my mattress. And then once the time comes, then I can go spend the money. Okay. So we think about money. One of the things that's been used as money the most sort of throughout history around the world is gold. And let's think about why we would want to use gold for money. So I've sort of I'm talking to some society 1,000 years ago, and I convinced them that they need money. And they're saying, all right, what do we use as money? And I say, well, I think you should use gold. And let's think about why. Well, the first thing is gold is a medium of exchange. So why do we say that? Well, it's something that's valued by lots of people, right? Lots of people like gold, lots of uses for it. And that's been the case for a long time. So if Michigan State decides to pay me in gold, I'm not really concerned that tomorrow people will wake up and decide they don't think gold is very cool anymore and nobody wants it. It's also small and portable. So you imagine that if Michigan State, where they decide they wanted to pay me in salt, well, salt is much cheaper, and for them to give me my salary in salt would be some huge amount of salt, and it certainly wouldn't be practical for me to carry all this salt around to the store and I want to buy a shoe. In terms of a unit of account, it's easy to weigh gold, right? So if you're to pay me in apple pies or something, it would be unclear, how many apple pies is this worth? What kind of apple pie is it? Whereas gold is pretty easy to weigh. All gold is the same. Once we can determine it's pure gold, all we have to do now is put it on a scale and see how much it weighs, and we know exactly how much it's worth then. So as a store of value, gold lasts forever. So it's not something that is subject to rusting. Okay. The picture on the bottom is saffron. So if you know anything about saffron, it's extremely expensive. It's actually that's the main thing you probably know about is that it's extremely expensive. It's in paella, and I'm sure it's in other stuff. I bought it once. It was some tiny amount in like a capsule that was $12. It was like one strand. So anyway, saffron fulfills the first two. It's small and portable. It's something that's been valuable a long time. It's easy to weigh saffron, but it does not last forever. If it's like any other food product, it's going to dry out and lose its flavor and go bad. So why do we use gold? So this was from someone took a periodic table and they asked a chemist, like, hey, go through this and talk to me about why gold has all these three qualities and nothing else really does. Well, gold's not a gas. So if you can't really make a gas or you can't make money out of a gas, or else, you open up your wallet and it's all just disappeared into the air. It doesn't corrode like iron, doesn't burst into flames like lithium, which seems kind of cool, but is not what you want to happen whenever you're handling money. It's rare. So imagine if I was being paid in something like cast iron, there's lots of it, and so it's cheap. I would need to be paid some huge amount of cast iron. Anything I bought would take some huge amount of cast iron, but it's not too rare. So there's something like osmium, which is an element that comes from meteorites. So there's so little of it, it'd be difficult to actually, get any significant amount to use as currency. So that takes us down to 5 elements. We've got some of them aren't, so the remaining 5, some of them aren't very old. So rhodium and palladium were not discovered until the 1800s, so we can't have a 1,000-year history of using those as currency. Gold also does not tarnish, or silver is something that can tarnish. It also can be easily shaped and formed. So I guess it's relatively easy to mold gold. I know it's like a soft metal. Platinum, on the other hand, which is another thing that has most of these properties, you have to get that to over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit to melt it, which was not a feasible thing to do, hundreds or thousands of years ago. So only gold remains. Like I said, I thought this was kind of a cool thing. All right. So, okay, so now we know all about why gold is used as money. Well, how about the US dollar? It doesn't really seem to have all of these. I mean, I guess you could say that in terms of, it is a store of value because the gold, the actual dollar bills do last a long time. And it's got the unit of account going for it because, if it says 100 on it, it's worth 100 times as much as a $1 bill. But unlike gold, it does not have what we call a high intrinsic value. So the only reason a $100 bill is not worth much because it's made of really nice paper or something. No, the main reason it's worth a lot is because US law says you can use US currency to pay your debts to creditors and to the federal government. So that means that when you have to pay your taxes, you can use dollar bills for that. So this is known as fiat money. So it itself has no intrinsic value. Instead, the money is backed by law. Another misnomer, businesses do not have to accept cash. So this note is legal tender. That does not mean the businesses are not allowed to say no $100 bills or